Welcome to our Impaired Driving Education Awareness virtual event. My name is Lily King with Mesa Channel 11, and thank you for joining us today. I want to go around and introduce our panel of guests. Stacey Good, the Assistant City Prosecutor with the City of Mesa. Officer George Shui, who is with the Mesa Police Department. And then joining us on Zoom is Joe Sullivan with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and Danny Montoya, a survivor of DUI. So thank you everybody for joining us today. This is a very important topic, and we would like to get started on this. So I'm gonna start off with Stacey.
Great.
Good to see you, Stacey. So with the passage of Proposition 207, recreational marijuana use, things have changed a little bit. Can you explain to me what those changes are and how does that affect the prosecution of DUIs here in Arizona?
So since November, the proposition has actually passed. Now, marijuana you're able to use it recreationally. You can legally smoke marijuana. There are limitations to that and how old you can be. You have to be 21 in order to buy it. Or to use it. You can only possess a certain amount at a time, and you're not allowed to smoke it in public. You're not allowed to smoke it in public areas. So now that it's legal, we do have more of a concern about people using marijuana and driving their motor vehicles, not knowing the concerns or the effects that marijuana might have on them. We're still able to prosecute, and we are prosecuting marijuana DUIs. If you're driving under the influence and you're impaired to the slightest degree, we will prosecute those DUIs. So you're looking at, if it's your first time offense, a minimum of 10 days in jail for driving while under the influence of marijuana. We want to focus on the impairment part. We want to keep our streets safe from impaired drivers. So even though this is now legal and people are able to smoke marijuana, we still will be focused on keeping our streets safe from impaired drivers, especially with marijuana.
So what other challenges are you facing as a prosecutor with these changes?
I would say one of the biggest challenges we have with DUI prosecution right now is a general lack of education and knowledge on DUI, impaired driving, especially when it comes to marijuana. We used to do, and I really do think that it's our duty as administrators of justice, not only to enforce these laws and prosecute them, but we need to do an educational piece as well. Law enforcement is obviously super important. We want officers on the street making those arrests, keeping our streets safe from DUI drivers, impaired drivers, drunk drivers. But we also want to do our part to prevent DUIs from happening in the first place. And the best way we can do that is with education. We want to talk to our community. We want to reach out and talk to our society about the dangers of DUI, about the changes in the law with marijuana, and how marijuana can affect you and your driving. We used to do it a ton back in the 80s and 90s. We'd have commercials all the time. You remember, like the frying egg can.
Yes.
We
Just
don't
say no campaigns.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. We don't do that anymore. We kind of dropped the ball in that regard. And so we have this new legalization of marijuana, a lot more people being able to use the substance and driving a motor vehicle, but not really having the educational background on it, on how impairing it can be, how it can affect your driving and make you a very dangerous driver and put our society at risk.
So just because that it's now legal to smoke or ingest marijuana at home, it still doesn't, you still have to be safe in thinking like, okay, well now, even though I can smoke or ingest this at home, I really shouldn't get behind a motor vehicle anyway or try to go anywhere outside of that. I guess some people probably equate it as being different, like it's different from alcohol versus...
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a misconception that marijuana isn't as bad as alcohol or not as impairing. The fact remains that it is an impairing substance. It will alter your mindset and make you an unsafe driver. We talk about divided attention a lot in our DUI investigations and our DUI trials. When you're using a substance like marijuana, it's going to affect your divided attention and make you unsafe to drive that motor vehicle. So even though it is legal, you can smoke it. There's nothing wrong with you smoking it now recreationally. You should not be driving. And you need to make sure that if you are going to use the substance, that you're doing it responsibly and you're not getting behind the wheel of a vehicle after you use the substance.
So what if people compound it with smoking marijuana and also consuming alcohol?
So there's actually been studies that show that compounding the substances makes you a lot more impaired. So alcohol and marijuana are both two totally different substances. They impair you completely differently, and they go through your body completely differently. So with alcohol, it's a hydrophilic substance. It's going to dissolve with water solubles in your body. So it enters your bloodstream, goes up into your brain, and then it is disposed of through your body. Marijuana is completely different. It's a lipophilic substance. And so that means that it's attaching to the fatty cells in your brain. Once you smoke it, it goes straight into your brain, it attaches to those fatty cells, and it remains there for a lot longer, which means that that active metabolite of marijuana can stay in your system a lot longer. Just because it lasts there a little bit longer doesn't mean it's any less insane. Anytime you have that active metabolite in your system, you are likely to be impaired by that metabolite because it's having that cognitive effect, right? And it's altering your cognitive ability to operate in the vehicle. There's also this misconception with alcohol and marijuana in that I think most people, when they think of an impaired driver, they think of that drunk driver. They think of somebody who comes out of a vehicle and they're falling down, they're slurring their speech, they're not able to walk the straight line. With marijuana, we see it completely differently and how it affects people. A lot of times we don't see somebody who is falling down or they might be able to walk the straight line, but we'll see more of that cognitive impairment. So they can't count to 30 without missing a few numbers in between. Or when the officer gives them instructions on how to complete a field sobriety test, they have to ask a bunch of follow-up questions on how to complete that test. Or their short-term memory is affected. All of those are direct signs of impairment by marijuana. They look completely differently, but the public isn't used to seeing them, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because alcohol has been legal a lot longer than marijuana has. So you've had a lot of interactions in the public with people who are under the influence of alcohol or even drunk. And you know that they're going to be slurring their speech or falling down drunk or maybe, throwing up or whatever. We haven't had that common knowledge base with marijuana impairment yet because it's just barely legal. Since January, people are now allowed to smoke it recreationally. So we don't have that common knowledge within the community of what somebody is high might look like. So that's also kind of been a challenge in our DUI prosecutions because our community isn't familiar enough with marijuana to know what somebody is high looks like, smells like, talks like, you know what I mean?
And then how do you prosecute that? Because it probably is different per individual too.
Right. Oh, for sure. Marijuana affects every single person differently, depending on how much or how often they smoke, what they're smoking, and the concentration of what they're smoking. Throughout the years, marijuana has changed dramatically. So back in the 60s and 70s, the average THC concentration of marijuana was around 7 to 10%. Now you can buy substances at the dispensaries that are up to 25% in THC concentration. If you have somebody who's never used marijuana before and now they are curious and want to use it because it's legal and they have every right to do that, if they don't know how that can affect them and they go and they get something in that high of a concentration, it has the ability to seriously impair them. So if you are going to try it and you're going to try something, especially with the edibles tend to have a little bit more of a higher concentration of THC. It's best to do it responsibly. Make sure you're doing it in the safety of your own home, that you're not going to be driving anywhere after, probably within even 24 hours, you shouldn't be driving a motor vehicle. And that you're really getting a feel for it and doing your research on the drug that you're using and what kind you're using before you take matters into your own hands and take some unnecessary risks.
Because you're probably seeing that too, right, Officer Shui, in part of what your officers are going out there with DUI arrests, and are you seeing that increase in people actually being impaired by marijuana?
Absolutely. With the passage of recreational marijuana, there are more people using it. They're uneducated in how it affects them while operating a motor vehicle. So those numbers, in my opinion, are probably going to continue to increase, especially with mixtures with alcohol and other drugs. Marijuana tends to be a gateway drug, so it does often open up the possibilities of drug substance abuse from other things.
So, and Stacey was talking a little bit about the impairment side of it, and then how different it is for each individual. So when an officer does arrest somebody and they are impaired because of marijuana, what are you guys looking for, and how are you able to distinguish, like, oh, okay, this might not be alcohol, this might be marijuana?
So one of the things that often happens when people get pulled over by police, they become nervous right off the bat. And we tend to be trained to identify those nerves versus impairment. Although they might sometimes look similar in nature, there are other things that we're looking for. If we do field sobriety tests, what are called divided attention tests, those tests are designed to divide one's attention because driving is a divided attention skill. So they are psychophysical tests, meaning they have to think about what they're about to perform, and then they have to actually do them the way that they were instructed by the officer to do. If you look at driving and how many things we do while we're driving, we hold the steering wheel, we step on the gas, we step on the brake, we watch for pedestrians on the road, street signs and stuff like that. Unfortunately, there's people that are Instagramming and Facebooking while operating a motor vehicle too. But those are all part of divided attention skills. So when we contact these people, we're looking to see if they are able to actually divide their attention through field sobriety test. Some other things might be poor perception of time or increased time, fine motor skills diminish, things like that. It's often what we're looking for.
So in Arizona, a lot of people say that it's a zero tolerance state. What does that actually mean, and can you clarify?
Sure. The misconception here that I get from a lot of people is if I pull them over and I smell alcohol, and I ask them, have you had any alcohol today? And they tell me no. And I often educate them and say, I do smell the alcohol, and I just want you to understand what it means is zero tolerance. Zero tolerance means that although you had one beer, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get arrested for DUI. It means that if you're drinking or consuming alcohol or marijuana, whatever the case may be, and you're impaired to the slightest degree, whether you reach a .08 BAC or not, you can get arrested in this state for DUI because you're operating a motor vehicle impaired to the slightest degree. So that's what we want people to understand. It doesn't necessarily mean because you just had a beer or you had marijuana the night prior that if the officer asks you because they smell something that, oh, you're going to get arrested right away for DUI. It's whether you're impaired to the slightest degree, and that's what we're looking for.
And majority of, the whole purpose is education and awareness and making sure that people understand how it affects their body, right? Because the last thing you want to do is to get behind a wheel and then end somebody else's life, potentially. I mean, it's that devastating.
Correct.
And we're going to segue a little bit over to Joe Sullivan right now, who is with MAD, which is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, Lily. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you for being here. Can you talk to us a little bit about what MAD does and the mission of your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. MAD's mission is to end drunk driving, help fight drug driving, such as marijuana, support the victims of these crimes, and to prevent underage drinking. So really everything that MAD does can kind of be broken down into two main areas, which is preventing these needless tragedies from happening while supporting the victims from these preventable tragedies.
So how are you guys going about in spreading this educational awareness through MAD?
So we do focus a lot on prevention and education. We have a program staff that focuses largely on talking to parents about how to have that conversation with, your children about alcohol, as well as driving under the influence and how to kind of prevent that moving forward, as well as going to the schools and talking to those children themselves. Additionally, we do education for offenders. Anybody in the state of Arizona that is convicted of a DUI has to attend one of our MAD victim impact panels, which not only talks about the consequences of DUI, but we have a survivor come and share their story so that they know the potential real-life consequences that driving impaired can cause.
So are you seeing more questions being raised by students or people that you're going out to these presentations and asking about recreational use of marijuana?
Certainly. That's something that we're seeing a lot more, especially in schools. With teenagers, that's something that can kind of become, a thought about topic in high schools, especially. And they have questions about, how dangerous is it? How does it compare to alcohol use? So fortunately, our staff is trained to have those difficult conversations, as well as, like I mentioned earlier, talking to their parents about how to have those difficult conversations with their children.
Because prevention is the key, isn't that right, Joe? You just want to make sure everybody understands and is aware of if they are going to take any sort of substance, that they understand it could potentially impact other people.
Absolutely, Lily. Prevention is 100% key. Driving under the influence is one of the crimes that, if everybody decided tomorrow that they're no longer going to drive impaired, that would be the end of it. And it's as simple as that. And that's what we're wanting to raise awareness about, is that, you know, these tragedies are 100% preventable. And while we want to continue to support the victims of these crimes, we want to also really work towards that future of no more victims.
Yeah. So joining with us as well on Zoom is Danny Montoya. And Danny, you are a survivor of DUI. Your son was lost due to DUI too as well. So tragic. I can't imagine having to experience what you've experienced. So can you share with us your story?
Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for having me on, and also thank everybody that's listening at this point. My son, if I may, my son Gabriel Matthew Montoya was 16 years old at the time of the accident. He was affectionately known as Gabe, not only by his family, but multiple peers at three separate high schools within the Las Cruces, New Mexico area. He was a very talented musician. He loved music. He preferred music over sports, although he did like sports. He was our fourth child, our third son. His two older brothers were very talented sports and football and track, but Gabe was passion was music. He played for about 5 years. He played the percussions and had several trophies and awards in southern New Mexico at various competitions, as well as El Paso, West Texas. He was well known around the Las Cruces area by his peers, and at his funeral there was over 500 people that came down, not only from the family and friends, personal friends, but also the high schools in the surrounding areas. He loved music so much that he even worked at a local music store after school to make ends meet and to buy himself a guitar. He loved music so much that he wanted to start a band, and I caught him one time teaching himself how to play the guitar. And I asked him, I said, "Aren't you going to be the drummer?" And he said, "Dad, drummers are a dime a dozen, but I need to have a good guitarist. So if I can't find one, I got to do it myself." That's how much he loved it. What happened the day of the accident? It was a Friday afternoon, and about 6 o'clock, he was going to go down to see his girlfriend. He was going southbound along the main driveway in Las Cruces when a pickup truck, a larger, heavy pickup truck, turned in front of him. The impact was extreme, that to the point that it demolished the car and made very little damage to the truck. It was almost like a head-on accident, and popped the top end of the truck off, of his vehicle off, and like I say, it just totaled it out. He wasn't going very fast. It was just a very large truck colliding with a small car. My son suffered extensive head injuries and was flown from Las Cruces to El Paso for treatment. We were notified after the helicopter left, and as we got to the hospital, he was in a coma. He did notice that we were there. He squeezed our hands as we went in, and stayed in a coma for 8 days. Several family members came and helped us try to pray for his recovery, but unfortunately on March 10th, 2002, he passed away. The driver of the vehicle, 62-year-old alcoholic. He had no driver's license. He had no insurance. He'd had several DWIs before, and he had been drinking all day on a Friday, and decided to go get more liquor at about 4 in the afternoon. On his way back is when the accident occurred. It's kind of funny. I really, at the trial, and the initial meeting with what happened, the police and the investigation, I really wanted to put him in jail. But I didn't want to put him in jail because of what he did with my son. I wanted to put him in jail so that he was not free to do it again and hurt somebody else. I wanted him off the streets for as long as possible. He should not have been driving that night or any other night. I can tell you that the pain was and still is excruciating, like no other imaginable pain that you can imagine. It's very so much so that it's like somebody tearing a piece of your heart out and throwing it away. It does not go away. Time, it does allow you to continue on. It allows you to go forward, but it doesn't take away the pain that occurs when you lose a loved one, whether it's a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife, or any other loved one that could happen, that could get lost in a DWI or in an impairment accident. In all honesty, the first year after it occurred, you're in total disbelief. You can't believe it happened, and you're in denial. It's one of those things where you're going to wake up. You're going to wake up as to what happened, and all this is going to go away, and your son's going to be in the bedroom next door, as he always does, sleeping soundly, getting ready to go to school. More than once, my son would go out, and upon his return at 10, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, he'd pop his head into our bedroom and say, "Mom, Pop, I'm home." And more than once, after that first incident, did it appear that I'd wake up almost thinking that I heard him say, "I'm home, Dad." The second year, towards the end of the first year, reality starts setting in. The pain starts setting in. The pain intensifies because now you know it's true. It's denial's out, and you wonder how you're going to go forward and how you're going to put your family together again. It was very life-changing for the entire family, for his brothers, for all his siblings, to include his sister and brothers. It's changed all of us. In our case, we lived probably 5 miles from the high school that he practiced at. And just like football, every August, September, the band would go out and practice on the football field, and we could hear them as they practiced. Every time that the band started playing after he left, it was just total breakdown for my wife, that knowing what happened and he wasn't out there parading or practicing with the band. In our case, we actually had to leave New Mexico. There was a daily reminder everywhere we went. There was friends of his that we saw on a daily basis, family. And in 2004, we actually moved to Arizona. And what caused that is we went out of town for a couple of months on a detail that I was on. And during that time, I could see my family, the two siblings that were, my two sons and daughter, my son and daughter that were at home, and my wife were starting to heal, even during that short period. So it was obvious we were going to have to get out of Las Cruces, and the decision was made that we would leave and come to Arizona for about 2 to 5 years. And of course, that was probably 16 years ago, and we're still here and made it permanent. Our family has moved out here. We go to Las Cruces on a regular basis just to visit my son's grave. It's the gentleman that once we went to court, the gentleman did receive the maximum sentence at that time, which was 6 years with no parole. As I said, the only thing I was asking is that this man be taken off the streets so that he's not be able to do this to somebody else again. It's very similar to the message I want to put out there. You know, we as victims, we're not out to crucify drinkers or people that use marijuana recreationally or drink responsibly. Our only desire is that you make wise decisions before you actually start drinking and make plans either for a designated driver, Uber, Lyft, friend or relative to drive or to pick you up. There's multiple avenues that you can take without getting behind the wheel. The impairment, driving impaired, whether it be through alcohol or marijuana, is what we're trying to avoid. That's our main message. As well, when you see somebody else, a friend, a relative, when you see them impaired to the point where it's obviously they cannot drive, we ask that you get involved even to the point of taking keys away. Worst case scenario is somebody loses their life and suffers for the rest of their life. You can also get arrested. It's very expensive, not only to hire a lawyer for court costs and everything else that the judge might throw at you. And the last time I heard, it was up to about $10,000 for a DWI case. A lot cheaper to do the Uber, Lyft, or even a taxi and take them home. With that said, again, I thank you all for listening. I thank you for the opportunity to be here and helping us put the message out to avoid driving impaired and driving drunk. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Very brave of you to share your story with us. Our heart breaks for you too, because there's that ripple effect, that one decision that a person will make that impacts so many other people and futures of other people too in their lives. And like as Danny was alluding to, there's so much that you can do with ride-sharing programs, taxi, call a friend, call your parents, whomever, right? So that we don't see this happen.
I agree with you. And you mentioned something that's a good point, is that not only does it affect the family, the victims of the family, but it affects the driver's family as well. You could see it in their eyes in court where the sorrow and the sadness that they had, knowing that that their husband or their dad or their uncle was going to go to prison for several years, and he was not a well man. He was sick and he was going to suffer in prison as well. So you could, when you say ripple effect, it goes both ways, towards the victims as well, and the driver or the impaired driver that caused the accident. My son had several friends who were affected, very close friends who were affected for years. Some of them got out of college for a couple of years and couldn't go back, and finally they were convinced to. But to this day, they still call us and communicate with us as to how hard it was for them as it was for us, because they were so close of a family, of a group, in band or in school or whatever they did together.
Yeah, absolutely. And the conviction rate that Danny was talking about as far as the prosecution side and getting 6 years, is that pretty common, Stacey?
So that would be more towards the felony convictions. When you have a case like Danny and his son had, you're going to get a lot more time. You're going to be prosecuted for a felony. In the city of Mesa, when we're prosecuting DUIs, we don't typically have cases where somebody has died due to the DUI. We do have other victims involved when there's an accident or something like that. And actually, there could be some substantial injuries that the prosecutors at the Superior Court or this Maricopa County Attorney's Office didn't think were high enough to actually prosecute that felony. So I have had a lot of victims that have suffered injuries that we prosecute for on the misdemeanor level. And sometimes, unfortunately, the most that we can get is 180 days in jail for a misdemeanor DUI. And sometimes that's what we end up getting. But yeah, there are a ton of victims. There are a ton of victims on the felony side, and people like Danny and Danny's son who have this tremendous loss in their life due to impaired drivers, and that really suffer because of the impaired driving.
And you just really don't want to see that translate over with the passing of Proposition 207, right? Because of what you were saying, like Officer Trey, there's just more and more people out there that have the potential to be impaired in both alcohol and marijuana too.
Absolutely, yeah. You'll see an increase in that combination as well. And again, with Danny's loss, he talks about some of the people that if you see somebody impaired or you see something that a friend or family member who shouldn't be driving, do something about it. I also take it to a point where you say, hey, you're hosting a party. Well, guess what? Before your guests leave, think about, would you let them drive your family? And if you can't answer that question, absolutely, I'd let them drive my family right now. You should be making arrangements for them to have some type of rideshare or something available for them to get home safely.
Or have them sleep over.
Oh, sleep over. Perfect. Yep.
Like, here's a pillow and a couch.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, Lily, one of the really big concerns too, especially with marijuana impairment, is the people who are impaired are the least likely to actually believe they're impaired. So there's even been scientific studies on that. When they are giving marijuana to their subjects in this study, the subjects will say they felt fine, that they didn't feel impaired at all, but there are actually lots of signs of impairment that were noticed within that scientific study. So there will be a lot of times when people are using this drug and think that they're safe to drive, but they're really not, and they're still putting themselves and the public at risk. So it's probably safe to just say, whenever you're using this substance and you're under the influence of it at all, you should not be driving a motor vehicle. You should just stay away from that, because there are so many other options that you can use, right? You're probably smoking with other people, you can use them to drive, but there's also options like taxis, Ubers, and Lyfts, and it's so convenient nowadays that it's really unnecessary to actually take that risk and get behind a motor vehicle after you've been using a substance.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have some questions that I'm going to go and try to see who amongst our panel can possibly answer it the best, but let's go ahead and take me.
Can I make one more point?
Oh, yeah, sure, Danny.
Can I make one more point? This particular group that's talking today, MAD, Joe out of MAD, the prosecutor's office, the officer himself, this was a team, or this was the group that got us through this tremendous tragedy of ours. Had it not been for the prosecutor's office that kept us informed and what was going on and how things were going, never kept us in the dark, and actually called us at times to see if we agreed with any decision that was made when a guilty plea was being put together. MAD, without a doubt, had it not been for them and their team down in New Mexico coming to our aid and asking us what we needed, helping us get through the court process, going with us to various court proceedings, making sure that we got what we needed at that time. And without a doubt, several of the policemen in that small town of Las Cruces would come down or call us to see how we were doing and to see if we needed anything. This team that you have put together, without a doubt, helped us get through the entire process. And I want to thank all involved, not only in prosecutors, the police, and those that are full-time MAD or volunteers. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. It does take a community in order to heal. You can't even equate to it. I couldn't even relate to losing a loved one like Danny has. But it is great to have the resources like MAD and like the prosecutor's office, and obviously, of course, our local law enforcement agency as well. So there's just a few submitted questions, and I'll just go ahead and go down the list and see how we can answer these. So the first one up is vaping and driving. Does it matter what you're vaping? Let's take that one.
You can jump in at any time as I'm answering this, but I believe there are several different substances that you can vape through a vape pen or the cartridge. One of the most common is THC, because you can get it in that form where it goes into the vape pen and you can use your vape pen to ingest marijuana. One of the biggest misconceptions we have now that marijuana is legal is it is okay to use marijuana whenever, wherever you want. That it's not that big of a deal and you can smoke as you're driving down the road. That is completely incorrect. You cannot smoke marijuana or use marijuana as an edible or however other means you're using it and drive your motor vehicle. If an officer is driving behind you and smells an odor of marijuana coming from your vehicle, they can stop you for a DUI. And they will likely do a DUI investigation and run the driver through the field sobriety test. And honestly, if you're using at the time that you're driving, they're probably more likely to find a lot more impairment because there's been such that recent use of marijuana. So if you are using your vape pen to ingest marijuana, you cannot, and you definitely should not, use it while you're driving because those signs of impairment are much more likely to be there as you're driving that motor vehicle, and it's making you a lot more dangerous to drive while you're under the influence of marijuana at that time.
Yeah, and I'll add on that. For those that are using vape pens, just ask yourself one question. If you're using the vape pen, what effect are you getting from it? And generally speaking, people that get an effect from something, well, obviously they are altering the way their body is performing at that given time. So if you're altering the way your body's supposed to be performing naturally while operating a motor vehicle, that's the almost definition of what impairment's going to be. Your body's not acting the way it should be to operate that vehicle safely. Therefore, if you're asking yourself, should you vape while you're driving, or should you vape prior to or during, whatever the case may be, just ask yourself, if you're getting effect from it and it's working like it's supposed to, then you're probably going to be impaired at that moment.
Have you seen yourself or other officers within the patrol department seen people vaping with marijuana and having to pull them over as well?
Yes, I've had a recent case a few months ago. There was vape pens involved. And if you know about different strains of marijuana, there's a sativa strain and an indica strain and a hybrid strain. And the quick differences between all of them, the sativa is an upper, more positivity, more energy. The indica is more of a downer, kind of puts you to sleep and calms you down, usually used for anxiety. And then the hybrid, depending on what's higher, sativa or indica, it's just a mixture of it. In this particular case, a gentleman's driving home during rush hour traffic, and he likes to take the indica strain. They explained to me what it does to them, how it makes them feel. And the last question I asked was, well, do you think it was okay during rush hour to be taking that strain, knowing that it makes you sleepy, knowing that it helps you go to sleep? And that was like an eye-opener for that person as well. So.
Lily, just to expand on that, I think we have a lot of people who, another big misconception of marijuana impairment is it makes you safer to drive because it slows down your senses and it makes you calmer, and you're more aware of your surroundings. That's a huge fallacy, right? We're talking about the different strains, indica versus sativa. Indica very well might calm you down, and a lot of people will take it for anxiety, and that's probably why this guy was drinking it during rush hour traffic, to help him calm down and be able to drive through rush hour traffic without freaking out. However, it's still having an impairing effect on your brain, right? And if you're able to feel that feeling of calmness, that means it's having an effect on you at that time. So you should not be using it to be calm and relaxed, but also driving a motor vehicle, because your senses are going to be off. You're going to have that cognitive impairment. One of the biggest things that gets impaired when you're using marijuana is your perception of time and distance. So if you're using indica to calm down, your sense of time and distance is going to be impaired. So you're a lot less likely to be able to stop for that red light when you need to, right? The light, every one of us knows when you're driving a motor vehicle, sometimes you look up and the light's red and you didn't realize it. If you're under the influence of marijuana, it's going to slow your reaction time down, especially with that indica strand, because it's relaxing you. If your reaction time is slowed, you're not going to be able to stop as quickly, right? So you might run that red light, causing a tragic loss like Danny and Gabe went through. Or you might not be able to stop in time when there's dead traffic stopped in front of you, right? So even though it does calm you down, that indica strand in particular, it really is still impairing. And so you're not a safer driver while you're under the influence. And that's something that I really wanted to address today, these huge misconceptions that the public has about marijuana and using marijuana, and just really getting the message out there that this substance is impairing and you should not be driving while you're under the influence of it.
And Joe, are you having to re-educate people in regards to vaping as well? Have you guys been doing that with the onset of vaping?
So we've kind of included that amongst our marijuana education that we do, because it is, ingested in so many different forms. Like Stacey was mentioning, it can be not only smoke, but it can be vape, as well as ingested as an edible. So we try and make sure that we include all of those, because it's also in oil tinctures and various things like that. And I think for a lot of people, especially young people that we're talking to, there is a misconception that, if you're ingesting it in a different way than the traditional smoking, that it might affect you differently, or that it might not alter what you're feeling as much as some of the other ways. So we'd like to not only, discuss how it can impair you, but also that no matter how you are ingesting it, that you are becoming impaired afterwards.
And going back again, it's all about education. Education is the key, right? Whether or not education through school, through other resources, through organizations like MAD, just getting out there and understanding, especially with all these onset of new products and things that are coming about, how that really changes people's lives. So the next question I have is it true that anyone who smokes marijuana will be arrested for DUI? Is that true? Who wants to take that one?
I'll take that. It happens a lot. And then, like I said earlier, we ask a question, hey, when was the last time you smoked marijuana? And right away they're like, oh, I don't smoke. Although you can smell it, or you can even smell the marijuana in the vehicle. And so, again, it's not necessarily that you're going to be arrested just because you've consumed it. It's whether or not you're impaired at the time that we contact you. And that's the difference. Again, we separate nerves from what we see, and we run them through a battery of field sobriety tests and also our observations. How are they acting when we contact them? How are they able to divide their attention to show that they're okay to operate a vehicle? That's what we're really going to be looking for. Regardless of whether you smoked marijuana or drank beer or had another substance in your system, it's whether it's affecting you at that given moment and if you're impaired, and that's what we're looking for.
Stacey, do you want to add anything to that?
I would just say overall, our goal with law enforcement is really to keep our streets safe from impaired drivers, right? So obviously marijuana is legal now. We don't care as much about people smoking marijuana. That's not what our objective is here, to stop people from smoking marijuana at all. This is not an anti-marijuana campaign. This is an anti-DUI campaign. We want the public to understand the dangers of driving while you're under the influence of any substance, whether it's marijuana, alcohol, or other prescription drugs or other illegal drugs, and especially if we're mixing those substances and how impairing that can be. And so when we're talking about DUIs and smoking marijuana and whether you're going to get that automatic conviction, what we really care about is, are you putting yourself and others at risk? Are you creating that public risk that we want to stop and prevent so that we don't have other tragedies like Danny's tragedy? We don't want stories like that to keep happening. Just like Danny was saying, we want to get that message out there so that other people don't get hurt like this. And so at the end of the day, our goal is to keep impaired drivers from being on the street. It's not to prevent people from smoking marijuana. So if you are using marijuana and we find that you are impaired to the slightest degree, then yes, you will get arrested and convicted for a DUI.
So then is it true that marijuana stays in your system for 30 days after you smoke or ingest or vape, I guess? Either or.
So depending on the person and how frequent they use marijuana, it can last there for 30 days. Generally, marijuana will impair somebody between the hours of 12 to 24 hours after last consumed. Does that change with people? Absolutely. One of the things that I look for is new marijuana users, people that have never smoked marijuana before. The minute they first smoke it, regardless of how much it was, just even a little bit, they're going to feel the effect of it because they've never done it before. That's more than likely going to show impairment compared to somebody who does it every single day and hasn't done it for the last 12, 24 hours. So depending on how the body metabolizes it, it can last up to there, and there's certain things that they're looking for when they're testing as far as what metabolites or what was active, psychoactive at the time. But that doesn't necessarily mean just because it's there, you're going to get arrested for DUI or convicted of DUI, whatever the case may be. It's just depends on the person, how the body metabolizes it at that given moment.
Is there a, like secondhand smoke, is there secondhand smoke in regards to marijuana too as well, or no?
Yes.
Yes. So if a person next to me is smoking marijuana, I just so happen to be in that same vicinity, then I could, if I go and drive my vehicle, I could very well be impaired and arrested too. That could happen?
Typically not. I mean, what we're looking at is whether the studies that have gone with impairment by secondhand smoke, like a common slang term for it is hotboxing, right? You're in the car with the windows rolled up, everybody's smoking weed, and you're breathing in that secondhand smoke to get high. The studies that have shown the secondhand smoke impairment were really like in a very closed room with hours upon hours of smoking that marijuana, and a lot of marijuana being smoked with no ventilation, air ventilation. And they were still only able to find like traces amount of marijuana in the person's blood. So there have been cases where we've had somebody try to use that defense of they weren't really using marijuana while they were driving, it was their passenger. That really is a fallacy, because as you're driving a motor vehicle, you have the air vents on, you have the windows down. You're not likely to get a certain level of marijuana in your system through that way in order to cause impairment. So it can happen, but it's really just gonna depend on the circumstances in which you're with somebody who's smoking marijuana, right? And how much they're smoking and what kind they're smoking.
Yeah.
So ideally, it usually is the driver who is behind the wheel, and obviously if he or she is have ingested or smoked or anything, they're the one that obviously will get arrested or at least pulled over.
Right.
Correct.
So as Officer Choi was talking about, marijuana is going to affect every single person differently, depending on how much they smoke. So you asked the question of whether marijuana can stay in your system for 30 days. The scientific study that has shown marijuana to still be in somebody's bloodstream, and I'm talking about the active metabolite of THC, the one that's actually impairing and can cause you to be an impaired driver. There have been studies that show that it can stay in your bloodstream for up to 30 days. But the person, and I don't think it was more than one person where it showed up in their blood 30 days later, was a very chronic user of marijuana, had been using for years. And he stopped using at a certain day, and then 30 days later, there were trace amounts of THC still in his blood. Most people don't smoke that much, right? So if you have a brand new user or somebody who's never used before and then they smoke marijuana, it's not typically going to stay in their system for that long. It can stay up there for several hours though. You're going to find that peak impairment about an hour after the last time you smoke or ingest the drug. The difference too with edibles is it takes about 30 minutes to an hour in order to go through your digestive system and up into your brain to be impairing. So you're gonna have a little bit more of a delayed effect there too. So if you are using things like the gummy bears or eating the cookies, which by the way typically have a much higher concentration of THC than the flour that you can use to make a joint or whatever, that will have a delayed response, but then it can also stay in your system a lot longer because it'll have a higher THC concentration, right? So I've actually heard stories of people who have never used or don't use very regularly, and then they go to the dispensary and they get their cookie, right? In this particular case, it was a cookie with a very high concentration of THC. And it will tell you on the instructions when you have this cookie to only eat a piece of it, like a quarter of the cookie. You can't eat the entire thing because it can be super impairing to have something with that high of a concentration. They did not read the instruction, they ate the entire cookie, and they told me they were still feeling the effects 3 days later.
Wow.
So when you're using something that you don't know what it is or how it's going to affect you, you might have that long-lasting effect that still makes you unsafe to operate a motor vehicle even several days later. But that's the tricky thing with marijuana is there's no like set standard, you know. With alcohol, we have scientific studies that show everybody above a 0.08 blood alcohol concentration is impaired to the slightest degree. Everybody across the board. We do not have anything like that with marijuana because everybody is affected differently, everybody smokes differently, and there's so many different strands and concentrations and different forms of marijuana that it's really hard to prove scientifically what amount of THC is going to be impairing for every person across the board. It could be also because it's just recently legalized, so our scientific studies haven't caught up to the legalization of it, right? It used to be just straight illegal to use marijuana, so we didn't bother doing those scientific studies to show when somebody or at what level somebody is impaired. But you know, we're trying to catch up with that, and we're producing more scientific studies as we go along. But as of right now, it's you're impaired by this. If you are, we're going to be able to tell through these field sobriety tests and our conversations with you, and to be able to see your cognitive impairment. And if you're impaired to the slightest degree, you are going to get a DUI. But you should be considering that before you even drive because you want to stay off the roads to prevent tragedies or even a DUI conviction.
It does make your jobs way harder, right? Because it's almost like with the onset of the passing the Proposition 207, you almost have to like retrain officers in like how to respond, how do I make sure that, you know, a sobriety test, you know, what am I going to be looking for to conviction rates on the prosecutor side as well, too. It just opens up a whole new subset of challenges and things that you have to follow through.
I think there are some challenges, some retraining that is going to go on. The Governor's Office of Highway Safety is putting out training for officers to recognize these impairments. However, impairment is impairment regardless of whether it comes from alcohol or from marijuana or any other substance, really. The officer's job on scene is to establish that impairment and document it as best as they can, what they saw and what contributed to the impairment. And that's really what they're going to be trained to do. We'll probably put out more training for them as far as some obvious indicators of marijuana consumption, some of the things like that that can lead them down a different path in their decision making for the DUI investigation. But for the most part, it's really not going to change. There's still going to be the same standard field sobriety test that we've done for years. They're just going to have to better document the things that they see.
So we only have a few minutes left with our time, and I do want to give everybody else a one last message. So, Danny, can I start with you? Just any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our viewers today?
No, I think I want to reiterate what the prosecutor said earlier, in that we're not out to keep people from recreational marijuana or enjoying a beer or any alcohol. Our purpose is try to think sensibly before you engage in too much drinking or any drinking that would cause impairment. All we want is to ask you not to drive, or ask you not to get behind the wheel. Not only for your safety, your family's safety, but somebody else or some other innocent person that's going down the road. That's all we're asking. Sound decisions, like somebody said, there's so many ways to avoid it, with Lyft and taxi and Uber and friends and relatives that make plans ahead of time, by all means. And that's all we're asking. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Joe, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
I just want to reiterate kind of, again, what Danny said, that, we are certainly not against alcohol use or marijuana use, but if you are going to consume, just plan for a sober driver. If you do have to go anywhere, make that ahead of time. That's really all we're asking, because a lot of these crashes that are caused by impaired drivers, I don't think the impaired driver left that night or that day with a plan to hurt or kill somebody. But ultimately, when you start your car after becoming impaired, you are driving a 1-ton vehicle that becomes a very dangerous instrument to anyone on the roadways with you. And while we know that, again, they didn't set out or plan to hurt somebody, ultimately, when you make the choice to drive impaired, that's exactly what you're doing.
Thank you, Joe. Alfred, Way, final thoughts?
Yeah, lastly, first thing that goes when you're impaired is your judgment, right? So a lot of the panel members today talked about making those plans before you start consuming stuff. That's definitely one of the biggest things you can do to prevent these tragedies from happening. But I also want to reiterate, alcohol has been legal for a long time, right? If you're over 21, you can consume alcohol. And now we've always educated people and said, hey, if you're under the influence of alcohol, get a DD. If you're over a .08, you'll be arrested and charged for DUI. Well, it didn't change the fact that alcohol was still legal and that you can drink and operate a vehicle and so on and so forth, as long as you're not impaired to the slightest degree. With marijuana passing, there's nothing that changes. Marijuana is legal. You can use it. However, it's just like alcohol. If you're impaired, you are going to get arrested for DUI. So we just want the public to understand that the excuse of, well, it's legal now and I can use it, doesn't take away any responsibility on the driver to not be impaired at the time operating a motor vehicle. So just think ahead, plan ahead, and just stay safe out there, because it's going to continue to increase. I think the numbers are going to start to increase pretty rapidly.
Stacy?
I just want to expand on something that Joe said a little bit earlier. When we're prosecuting people for DUI, we're typically not prosecuting a bad person, which makes our jobs a little bit more difficult. Usually these are very good people that just make a huge mistake, and they have to live with the consequences. And sometimes it is a huge consequence, like killing somebody like Gabe. And we want to prevent that as much as possible. The new proposition, Proposition 207, which legalized marijuana, is called the Smart and Safe Arizona Act. If you're using marijuana, you should use it smartly and safely. Make sure that you have that designated driver ahead of time, or you're using it in a place where you don't have to drive anywhere, and you're keeping our roads safe and you're preventing future tragedies from happening.
Thank you. There is a website that you guys probably have posted online for more information. I just want to give that out to our viewers. It's mesaaz.gov/cannabis and DUI, and that page has a wealth of resources, right, Stacy?
Yes, we've posted some scientific studies on there, a lot of the scientific studies that I've talked about today, and other resources. I think there's a link to Matt on there, so if you are a victim of a DUI, you can use that as a resource to get a hold of some victim advocates like Joe Sullivan, who can help you through your case and the process and with the coping part of it as well.
Great. It's such a preventable thing to do, right? Just be aware. This forum hopefully will help everybody understand that education is the key and that it is no different. Just with the marijuana being passed, it is no different from alcohol. So I wanted to thank you, all of you guys, for joining us here today, and just be safe out there. Think wisely before you're about to get behind the wheel. Thank you so much for joining us.